Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the second NCCN Global Policy webinar this year, The Growing Role and Current State of Patient Advocates in Cancer Research and Clinical Trial Design and Development. My name is Katy Winckworth-Prejsnar, and I'm the Director of the Global Program here at the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. NCCN is a not-for-profit alliance of 33 leading academic cancer centers dedicated to improving and facilitating quality, effective, equitable, and accessible cancer care. Through the leadership and expertise of clinical professionals at NCCN member institutions, NCCN develops resources that present valuable information to numerous stakeholders in the healthcare delivery system, most notably the NCCN Clinical Practice Guidelines in Oncology. The library of NCCN guidelines now covers 88 different guidelines, which feature over 220 algorithms and cover about 97% of cancer cases worldwide. The majority are disease-specific guidelines, but we also have supportive care, detection, prevention, and risk reduction, as well as guidelines for specific populations. The library of NCCN guidelines and clinical content is utilized throughout the world. We have nearly 1 million registered users from outside the US, and last year, over 7 million guidelines were downloaded ex-US. As you can see from this heat map, NCCN guidelines are accessed in nearly every country around the world. NCCN appreciates and recognizes the supporters and sponsors for this webinar series. Without your support, this webinar would not be possible. Thank you. Today's program will focus on the tools and policies that support patient engagement in and access to clinical trials and research. This is a topic that NCCN addressed back in 2021, and we are thrilled to hear from our speakers how the landscape has shifted since then, the achievements that have been made, and the barriers that continue to exist. And most importantly, the ways we can apply patient-driven solutions globally and locally. The program will begin with a presentation from Dr. Miriam Mutebe, who will discuss clinical trials and research in Sub-Saharan Africa. Next, we will hear from Jan Geisler, who will cover the patient-focused approach to cancer research from the European Union experience. Finally, we will host a live panel discussion focusing on strategies that improve patient-centric clinical research worldwide. Our moderator for today's webinar is Matthew Robinson. Dr. Robinson is the Senior Director of the NCCN Oncology Research Program, which strives to improve and prolong the lives of people with cancer by advancing collaborative research. Dr. Robinson recently joined the team at NCCN, and we are thrilled that he's moderating today's panel session. At this time, allow me to briefly introduce both of our keynote speakers, Miriam Mutebe and Jan Geisler. Dr. Mutebe is a breast surgical oncologist, health system researcher, and assistant professor in the Department of Surgery at the Aga Khan University in Nairobi, Kenya, among many other roles. As a passionate advocate for an inclusive, gender-transformative approach in the treatment of breast cancer across Africa, she's co-founder of the Pan-African Women's Association of Surgeons and the president of the African Organization for Research and Training in Cancer Aortic, where she's focused on advancing research and training and enabling patients and community groups to be peer-level partners to the African oncology research community. Next, we will hear from Jan Geisler. Jan Geisler has been a cancer survivor, patient advocate, and patient engagement expert for 23 years. He's the founder and CEO of Pavocates and the director of the European Patients Academy. As a patient advocate, he co-founded numerous patient organizations, including LeucaNet, WeCan, CML Advocates Network, Acute Leukemia Advocates Network, and ECPC. Jan represents patients in committees of European Union projects and medical societies, and is an ethics committee member. We are thrilled that both speakers are here today to share their experience with you all. Their presentations have been pre-recorded, but we welcome the opportunity to answer questions during the live panel discussion. We look forward to an active conversation today and welcome your questions and engagement throughout the program.
Hello, everyone. My name is Miriam Mutebi, and I'm a breast surgical oncologist based at the Aga Khan University in Nairobi, Kenya, and the current president of the African Organization for Research and Training in Cancer. Today, I'm grateful to the NCCN for the opportunity to share some insights around patient engagement and clinical trials in Africa. And so over the next few minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit about the changing demographics that exist before drilling down to cancer research in Africa and reflecting on some of the strategies for patient engagement, not just in clinical trials, but in research, in cancer research in Africa generally, and some of the opportunities for both regional and international collaboration with aortic and other stakeholders in this setting. As many of you know, our patients tend to be diagnosed at a much younger age, typically 10 to 15 years younger than their counterparts in the West. And despite advances in increasing awareness and in expanding the workforce, we still have the majority of our patients diagnosed with advanced disease. If we look at the reasons behind this, we see that patients are having to pay out of pocket in order for them to access care, frequently resulting in financial toxicity. And this is further compounded by dysfunctional or inefficient or poor referral pathways, and sometimes a lack of awareness of signs and symptoms of cancer around healthcare providers, resulting in patients seeing 4 to 6 healthcare providers before definitive diagnosis of their cancer is made. Further compounded by social cultural barriers that exist, such as stigma, that may result in delays in diagnosis and ultimately poorer patient outcomes. We do know, however, that this fundamentally remains an equity concern, where we know that 70% of all cancer-related deaths occur in low and middle-income countries, many of which are in Africa, contrasted by only 5% of the global oncology resources being spent in this setting. It is really a call to arms for us as a global oncology community to think about how do we start to change this. Research is a key pillar and is the bedrock of national cancer control planning, and is really fundamental in terms of helping to drive and prioritize cancer control initiatives in a country. However, the 2022 Lancet Oncology Commission on Cancer Control in Sub-Saharan Africa demonstrated a paucity of policy that was driven by evidence-based policies in our setting. And we make the case for the need to have stakeholder-based needs assessment alongside data-driven evidence as the driver towards interventions and prioritization of cancer control strategies. As a follow-up to this, Aortic, in collaboration with King's College London, wanted to get a sense of, well, what is the research landscape in our setting? And so we did a bibliometric analysis that tried to look at cancer research over a 12-year period from 2009 to 2020, and we found about 24,000 cancer research papers. However, what we noticed was that cancer research on its own was only about 8% of all African health research. And what it really should be an opportunity for us to think about how to expand this was that 67% of all the papers from Africa were from 5 North African countries, with 49 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa contributing to about 14% of the total output, which really begs the question around how we can start to expand this. We also tried to look at what was the disease burden versus the amount of research that was ongoing. And so simply cancers to the left of the graph are basically demonstrating a research output that is commensurate with the disease burden. And so you'll find things like breast cancers and hematological malignancies do have an appropriate amount of research in our setting. But then looking at what the other high burden cancers are, whether it's cervical cancer, colorectal cancer, liver cancers, prostate cancer, esophageal cancers, we notice that they are woefully on the right side of the graph, really underscoring the mismatch between the disease burden and the amount of the amount of research that is being generated around these what would be priority areas. And so we tried to ask ourselves, what could be some of the drivers to this? And what we looked at was looking at the country, who was generating or who was driving the research, because whoever is paying for the research will drive the agenda. And what we saw was, looking at the top countries in Africa, what we noticed was that the countries that generated the most research were actually having the research driven by in-country priorities, as opposed to many countries in the remaining top countries in Africa, where we noticed that quite a number of foreign investment or foreign researchers are the ones initiating the research in the setting. And so this might work where there is an alignment of priorities, but sometimes if there's a misalignment in terms of the research priorities are not necessarily commensurate with who is paying the piper, then we start to see the paucity of priorities being represented in this setting. We also tried to look at looking at the global output of research by domain, whether it was in Africa, Europe, and Latin America. What we noticed, whether it's in research around epidemiology, diagnostics, surgical aspects of care, or care delivery, what we noticed is that there's hardly any difference in these three charts. And what does that tell us? It tells us that this is the African research priorities are being driven by the global forces, which are not necessarily always in alignment with what the local needs and priorities are in a setting. For instance, majority of our patients are diagnosed with advanced cancers, as I mentioned. So one would expect an increase, for instance, in the number of research around palliative and supportive care. But again, this is echoing trends that are seen globally, which really begs the need to sort of break that down, whichever context, whether it's Africa and Latin America, to think about what are our research priorities and how do we then start to move those forward. So what are we doing right? I think, and where could we improve? I think what we're seeing is that despite being a large continent, Africa is only contributing to about 2% of the global knowledge, which really, to me, is an opportunity to expand that to hopefully 98% or more. And looking at questions of equity, where 13 out of the 54 countries were responsible for over 90% of the total cancer research, really tells me that we can do better in terms of expanding the research output continentally. Anecdotally, this came out in the news about 4 years ago, where the headline said cancer research from the West won't work on Africans, whereas this might be an oversimplification. We all know anecdotally that different regimens and different protocols or different medications that we give to our patients sometimes do not work as well as we expect, or we're seeing disease progression despite what data is showing in different settings, really begging the need to perhaps have a local control or check to see how are we doing in terms of international protocols. This is just an example of the a study done at our setting where a team were looking at basically the genetic signal for triple negative breast cancers in women of Kenyan, African American, and Caucasian ancestry. And if we look, I don't expect you to interpret the blanket, the Maasai blanket, as I call it, but if we look at the differences in the upregulated genes for women of who are Caucasian, Kenyan in the middle, and African American, we actually see there's a lot of heterogeneity that exists within these three different groups. And looking at the genes that are downregulated, again, we see this clear, glaring difference. At times, in the setting of research, people say, well, African Americans may perhaps be a marker of what's going on the African continent, but we're seeing clear genetic diversity in what's happening across these different groups. And that really tells us, in this age of personalized medicine, are we really treating patients appropriately if we do not have considerations for these different subgroups and subsets and representation in all studies, including clinical trials. So what are some of the challenges of getting this out of the gate? Some of the things that have been cited are a lack of, dedicated research teams and protocols. Again, challenges of really trying to pool resources, whether it's from an IRB or having turnaround times that are not necessarily, or regulatory frameworks that might be work against getting timely engagement in clinical trials. But facilitators of research were really around building these teams and the desire to for a more collaborative strategy on the continent around cancer research in general. I think some of the things that we've been seeing, especially from a pharma or a clinical trial perspective, that has been largely driven by pharma, is again, there's been heterogeneity of care. Access to medication has also been quite diverse, where we know, for instance, in many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, they're paying 3 to 4 times the equivalent of the drug, of the cost that would be in a similar low and middle income country. And we've had a couple of access programs that ensure that do not necessarily have a long-term sustainability model. And there has been a general skepticism around clinical trials, especially for pharma, that can this actually happen in Africa? And not reflecting on the fact that we've actually had a 60-year history of running clinical trials, largely in infectious diseases, but that framework does exist and could readily be extended to clinical trials in oncology. There's also been a general skepticism around, from the patients, around how do we, clinical trials where people see these as experimentation. And again, we don't necessarily have the best history historically in terms of inspiring confidence in patients engaging in research. So how do we start to think through these? I think when we think about patient engagement, we do need to think about endpoints. From a clinical perspective, we tend to be really focused on tumor-centered clinical endpoints. What does the disease-free survival look like? What does the progression-free survival look like? But I think we really need to start zoning or drilling down to patient-reported outcomes, where we're ensuring that the cure is not worse than the disease, but really trying to look at it from the patient journey, where we're looking at, are our studies, is the research addressing toxicities of treatment? Is it addressing concerns around psychological concerns or body image? Are we looking at aspects that, especially in our setting, are key, like financial stability? And how are we ensuring that the day-to-day workings of our patients are ongoing despite the treatments that are happening? There's also key need to really bring in concepts around shared decision-making. We've had a bit of a hangover from a paternalistic approach to care, but then looking at, especially when dealing with vulnerable populations, how do we engage them in research? How do we ensure that their voices are heard? And how do we ensure that we're not having a top-down approach, but really engaging communities in these settings? And the ultimate goal is to move from investigator-driven research to community-driven participatory research. But in order to do this, we do need to look at, how are we engaging with the community? How do we have an understanding of what the community's perception of disease is, what their understanding of the research and treatments that we are talking to them are about? How can we come up with strategies? How do we work with the community and not just in the community? And this really involves, do we have the necessary skills in order for us to engage? And this can come to as simple as cultural competence, having a sense of who are the champions or leaders in that community, who are the, whether it's religious, whether it's spiritual, do we have the linguistic capacity? We did a recent study on the language of cancer, and we recognized that perhaps even our communication of what we're trying to do ultimately doesn't really encourage enrollment, where we tell people, for instance, that we're going to smash your breast, chop it off, and then burn the area. And then we're wondering why many people are not signing up for this. So it really begs, it's really having that nuances, but also looking at what is the value add to our patients and what is the long-term commitment, not just sort of doing a drive-by, two-year study, but how do we build systems that will actually ensure sustainability and engagement with communities? Critical link to this would really be the primary healthcare providers, whether it's the clinical officers, the community health workers or nurses, who are really the interface between clinicians and researchers in trying to increase engagement with our communities. But also, I think one of the untapped resources that we have is really our cancer survivors, who will really speak to the lived experience, are critical in terms of getting policymakers to listen, but also reducing stigma in the community by coming out openly, but also providing opportunities to encourage enrollment in these trials. I think there's a need to hone in the research advocacy that tries to look at how do we keep the patient voice central. And this is key because we need our patients to be on the IRBs to really look at these clinical trials and other research to say, does this make sense for the community? Does this make sense for the long-term management of my condition? Once the study terminates, will we have access to these medications? So these are the critical aspects that we do need our cancer research advocates really to try and push and champion. Over the pandemic, we did see, despite the initial panic, we did see an exponential increase in telemedicine, but also an expansion of patient navigator roles and community initiatives that I believe will start to help both the engagement and enrollment. And the initial reception of, using technologies was such that, the initial, whether it was virtual tumor boards or support groups, was an appreciation of, getting more pooled collective expertise, but again, more time with the clinicians and the oncologists, which was well received, but also being cognizant of the fact that we don't necessarily want to worsen disparities and ensuring that technology is not used as a divider of, access to care. So through the African Organization for Research and Training, whose goal has really been around transforming cancer control in Africa, through our major aspects, through our major committees, which is both the research committee and the education and training, which have really been looking at how do we reduce how do we develop Afrocentric research that's really context-specific and driven by teams on the ground. Part of what we've been doing through our clinical trial community of practice is really the convening aspect, where we're getting all the people, all the researchers, or anybody who is doing clinical trials in Africa to come together to the table and say, what are you doing? What is best practice? How do we work together? How do we, again, leverage on each other's strengths? One of the things that we're doing is really around mapping sites that are running clinical trials on the continent, looking at the preparedness, looking at who is in the wings waiting, and how do we elevate and support those other settings to get to be able to properly run clinical trials, but also looking at the advocacy. We're looking at how do we increase investment in research and in research capacity, which is through our higher level advocacy, whether it's in collaboration with the African CDC or with the WHO, Afro, and other stakeholders. These are the key questions that we're asking as Aortic, but also looking at how do we ensure that the grassroots advocacy continues. And this is through our research advocacy training, where we're enhancing community engagement through our CSOs, ensuring that the footprint and the patient's voice remains constant through. I think there's an opportunity for us to think about both regional and international collaborations. And I think Aortic is positioned to play a key role in this continental discourse, really especially around with policy development, but also the grassroots mobilization. But again, in providing the workforce that are running clinical trials, and it's across the continuum, whether it's through oncology nursing, oncology pharmacy, because we cover the entire cadre of care. It's looking at how do we then tap into existing initiatives and efforts, and how do we really get that multidisciplinary support and build advocacy that really translates into better care for patients. And so I think in summary, I would say clinical trials are feasible, have been running, but clinical trials in oncology are currently ongoing and provide a way to increase value-based care. I think universal access to care is a crucial component. There is an effective advocacy is key to patient engagement, but really empowering our patients through initiatives and education strategies will really help us to move the needle. And I think the pandemic has sort of given us a reset button where we have to think through what are some of the innovations that we can leverage in order for us to improve not just research, but ultimately patient care. It's just to, again, thank you all for your attention and time, to thank the NCCN for this opportunity to share, Aortic and Aga Khan, my primary institution, and to you, the audience, for your time. I'm open to questions in the Q&A. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak at today's webinar of the NCCN. Thank you for inviting me again after 2021. My name is Jan Geisler. I'm a cancer patient for 24 years, and I'm also a patient advocate, mostly active in Europe and also globally. And I'm going to speak about a patient-focused approach to cancer research, of course, from a European perspective. And I'm going to take you through a couple of things that have happened since 2021 and how cancer patient advocacy and research is actually developing. So first of all, I want to talk about, unfortunately, this is still the situation in 2024, because most cancer patients, and there are more than 230 different cancers, that's the situation patients are being faced after diagnosis, after progress of disease. Usually they need to take decisions on unattractive choices and trade-offs because they need to either decide for the bad, for the ugly, or for the unknown if they try to take experimental therapy. So the challenge is when we talk about data is of course very important, but in the end, single patients only have one life, and that's the trade-off that they need to actually take. And of course, they want to take their decisions on the best data available and on the best treatment and care available. And that's why we're all here. We're trying to talk about making research really delivering to the expectations of patients to get away from the bad, the ugly, and the unknown. That's our common goal. So what should industry and academic researchers as well as regulators learn from patient advocates? What we want to move away from is this glossy statement on patient centricity. I mean, today, even 2024, that's worse than in the past. Everybody's talking that they're so patient-centric. But in the end, we need to really understand what patients really need. We need to adapt to the day-to-day reality of patients, need to better understand what unmet need and real value is for patients. And we need to generate patient-reported evidence because there's a lot of things we cannot find out if the physician or an investigator reports observations. We often need to actually assess what patients really think and experience. I'm going to go more in depth on that. In the end, the goal is to co-create clinical trials, healthcare services, and information resources that lead to wiser investment of limited resources. Because no matter if a study is being run by an academic institute or by the pharmaceutical industry, every life and every month is wasted if we run trials that do not recruit or do not respond to what patients really want. So we all want better trial design. We want to have more effective research, and we want to have better data. And you might remember, for those that joined my presentation 2021, today patients and the patient community has a key role with all stakeholders. So there's been a lot that has happened over the last couple of years. So patients have a role in the public to form public opinion about research funding, healthcare spending of taxpayer money, or research funding from all kinds of philanthropic and commercial sources. They're involved in competent authorities, so FDA and EMA have huge programs involving the patient community when they need to take decisions. Policymakers are increasingly relying on the patient community to contribute to policy advancements and legislation. Research ethics committees are actually involving patients, and huge changes have actually happened in Europe through the new clinical trials regulation, which actually recommends patient involvement in ethics committees and ethics reviews, which means that all the ethics committees are now working with patient input. HTA, or health technology assessment, or payer decisions are, of course, crucial. And also there's been a huge shift in the last couple of years about patient involvement. And finally, of course, clinical research. I'm going to zoom in on clinical research more in this webinar, but in the end, patients have a huge role to play in all these different healthcare stakeholders. And just to talk about that, that's not a new fashion. It's not going to go away, and it's not going to be something that has gone in 2 years, because it is not something that has come up in the last 3 years. It's the result of 30 years of revolution in patient advocacy. Very early on with the HIV community, which was very unrestful in getting a voice and a seat at the table, over the FDA starting to involve the patient community, the EMA starting to involve the patient community, increasingly associations picking that up, building frameworks and all kinds of guidances on patient involvement. The ICH actually reflecting patient opinion, and also additional tools. So there's been a long evolution, but I would say in 2017 to 2020, it really started to boost and accelerate. In the recent years, patient involvement has really become a key and essential part of research and regulatory decision-making over the years. And if we just look at guidances and tools and methodologies and frameworks, when we met last couple of years ago, people will say, yeah, I understand the concept, but how on earth should I do that? Today, we have an abundance of tools, guidances, and frameworks created by PFMD, created by EU-PADI, created by many other institutions. And I'm just giving you a flavor here. Of course, I can't go into all the details, but you can see that a lot of these tools, methods, and frameworks have emerged over the last couple of years. So it's no longer a question of how do I do it, but what kind of methodology or tool I can use to make effective patient engagement happen, no matter whether it's on how do I involve patients in clinical trial design, or whether it's how do I write effective plain language summaries, or how do I involve patients in regulatory decision-making, or how do I co-create patient-reported outcome measures if there's a gap. There are guidances and tools and methods for almost everything. The artwork is probably more to find the right tool for it, because there's such a lot on that. And I'm just giving you some examples which emerged after the last webinar. So for example, with the philanthropic Rising Tide Cancer Foundation in Switzerland, we actually developed guidance and recommendations on patient involvement collaborative research projects. So more publicly funded projects, or those funded by philanthropic researchers, where there were often the questions of these collaborative research projects: how do we make that happen? How do we involve patients during the application phase when we apply for public grants? Or how do we establish effective models beyond the typical patient advisory board? There was a huge gap, and that's why we developed guidances, which you can find, of course, with the links I mentioned down there. They're the same guides for applicants of collaborative research projects, for those consortia or whatever that apply. There's the same guide with similar information for patient organizations. And there's also a guide for funding institutions, because they are also reshaping their funding framework to make sure that there's patient involvement when they generate their funding calls. There's patient involvement in the review of applications, and there are, of course, effective models in the projects that they fund later on. So that's described in those guidances that might help you also when you think about, how do I do that? How do I include the patient community effectively in the project that I'm planning, in the research project? And just to give you a flavor out of that, over the past couple of years, because in Europe, we probably have a tradition of 10 to 15 years of patient involvement in publicly funded projects, so EU projects or IMI projects and so on, different roles emerged. And the classical model is, of course, having patients in the steering committee or having them as an advisory board member in a study. But there are more models, like in patient involvement hub, where patient organization is coordinating patient input from multiple organizations, and they are the ones that are part of the research consortium. Or being even work package leader. This might be a European expression, but in the end, it's a specific sub-project in a research project where they co-lead, for example, the patient information, dissemination, or coordinating stakeholder input, or they are part of the research team when it comes to, for example, recruitment strategies or different things. So work package leader is an emerging concept. So there are different roles, and I'm not saying this is the golden model that everybody should be using. Of course, a translational research project with a lot of preclinical work has a different effective method of patient engagement than a late phase clinical project, or maybe a post-marketing, post-launch project on existing drugs to do therapy optimization. So there are different, let's say, flavors of that. And in the end, there's an example for almost all of that. So when, for example, designing your research project, you can think about what is the right model? What is the patient community in there that I would like to involve? How can I involve them? And how can I make sure that they feel comfortable, can provide very good input, are being compensated, or are part of the research consortium? There's a lot of different models out there. And just to give you a flavor that this is not theory, this has developed over here in Europe quite a lot. There's a public-private partnership with multiple billions of research funding that actually goes into consortia project in Europe, which is called the Innovative Health Initiative. Used to be called IMI. And in 2019, about 1/5 of the IMI-funded projects actually involved patient organizations. In 2021, that was already 60%. And I would say today it's standard practice in most projects that the patient community is somehow involved, either as part of the research team or in advisory functions or in the nitty-gritty day-to-day work of the projects. And you can just find some examples here of IMI-funded projects and the organizations that were part of that. But I would say if you look at the reports of EU-funded projects today, you always find a reference to what the patient community did in that. And now I'm coming back to a bit, and I'm trying to be very practical now. So coming back to what we discussed back in 2021, there's this roadmap about patient involvement in clinical trials and practice on the clinical trial level. And I can't go into that in detail, but you can see in each of these points, from setting the research priority of a clinical study, over clinical trial design and planning, over conducting the clinical trial, and all the market authorization, regulatory, and post-launch activities. Each of these points has very relevant points where the patient community can provide input, relevant endpoints, and so on. And I just like to zoom in on protocol design, because the patient community can say a lot about, is it right to have only survival, primary, secondary endpoints on survival in a clinical study, or is it worth considering a secondary exploratory endpoint on quality of life? Are the inclusion-exclusion criteria close enough to real world, or what's the risk-benefit of a ratio of a clinical study when we're trying to exclude patients and protect them from additional risk from the investigational drug, against trying to be more real world, to have as close proximity to the later users of a specific therapy? How can we support mobility and logistics? And in the last 3 years, we had huge discussions about hybrid decentralized trials. How can we bring research to patients instead of patients to the clinical trial center? So a lot of discussions about mobility and decentralized trials there. And of course, drug administration and necessity of diagnostics, and discussing about the schedule of events and so on. But I would like to zoom in now mainly on patient-reported outcome measures and quality of life and patient preferences, because this has been an emergent field in the next couple of years. And why is that? I mean, if we're all as successful, we all hope that survival will no longer be our main challenge in cancer. I know we're not there yet, but if you look at chronic myeloid leukemia or a couple of cancers, today already we have very high survival with the therapies that are on the market. So what's the coming issue then? It is how patients survive. It's no longer that patients survive. And that's essential triangle because we very often discuss very unidimensional about quality of life or patient-reported outcomes. But in the end, it's a triangle. It's a triangle of patient preferences because we want to understand what are the patient's unmet needs and priorities. Is what we're researching on and the endpoints and the outcomes that we're all targeting for in research, is this really the thing that patients favor most? What's their trade-off between survival and the time they survive, and let's say how they survive? So how do we trade that off? Then patient-reported toxicity. I'm on the Lancet Hematology Commission as well, where we discussed a lot and published also 2 papers about how to reform toxicity measurements. Because if you could look at cancer studies, we mostly talk about frequency and severity of side effects, but we don't know, is this happening in the beginning? Is this wearing off? Is it coming back? Is it getting more over time? And so on. What the essential part is cumulation, transience, and severity of side effects. And there are measures for that, like Pro-CTCIE and others. And we know that we need we need to have that patient-reported toxicity also as part of the studies to actually understand what is happening and what is happening between all these clinical visits of a study. And then finally, patient-reported outcomes, of course, but also there we see a lot of uptake on patient-reported outcome measures, but very often they're not very sensitive to patient reality. They are more introduced like EQ5D to actually compare against another population or the healthy population for cost-effectiveness measures. But in the end, very often generic instruments are being used instead of being very symptoms and disease specific to actually measure what does quality of life really mean in that disease context? What are the activities of daily living and what is the patient satisfaction? And there are measures like from ERTC and others that measure that in wide granularity depending on the cancer. And this is the triangle. This is actually, we need to see in combination when we know what patients want and need, what they experience in terms of toxicity, and what their impact of that is on their quality of life and activities of daily living. If we understand that triangle, we can talk to authorities properly and say, well, the value is that's what patients want, that's what they experience, and that is what their impact is. Otherwise, authorities will continue just looking at hard endpoints like survival, because that's very easy to measure whether somebody's dead or alive. So this is essentials. And the patient community has been pushing for this. And I'm going to give you, in my last couple of minutes, a bit of a flavor on that. Because we know that even if prompts are being used in studies to seek real-life experience from patients, very often the concepts that are used are poor. So we might measure outcomes that are not important to patients, even if we measure them accurately, or we see poor measurement methods being used that we identify an outcome that is important to patients, but it's very difficult to interpret. And patients can actually help because they understand patient reality, so they can help to choose the right prompt and the way we ask patients, whether it's ePro or whatever kind of pro, or it fits into the study or even in clinical practice to understand which data to collect in what way from participants of research to understand patient reality. So how we ask the question, how do we deliver the questions, when are the questions delivered, how they're being recorded, and how is the data being interpreted. And I don't have time to go into that. Over the years, we've also published guidance on how to involve patients in developing prompts. Because there's a lot of prompts out there, but sometimes there are gaps. Sometimes we need to develop new instruments. And there's a shared responsibility between the steering committee and the patient community to support pro-development to be most effective. And you can find a reference here from that as well. So just to give you a bit more example, this is now hot off the press because the patient community is running a project at the moment, which is called EUROACT, the European Atlas on Clinical Trials in Cancer and Hematology. And it's a collaboration of 27 pan-European umbrella organizations in cancer and malignant and non-malignant hematology, because we want to know in all the studies run in WHO Europe, so in about 50 countries across Europe, in the past 5 years, which pro instruments, which prompts have been used in these trials to understand, is this in wide use? So is prompts a reality in clinical research? And also collect evidence. And if there's prompt use, has that been published? So is the data available for researchers or for clinicians or for authorities to actually understand what patient-reported outcomes are out there? And the goal of that is actually to do patient advocacy on that, to use that data to change practice in terms of those. So here's some unpublished data. I know I shouldn't be presenting that, but it excites me so much because that's early reading from our EUROACT program, where we can actually see, and you can see in that graph on the left, that's phase 2 studies that we found. We looked at data, so the abstracts and the protocols of more than 5,000 clinical studies in solid tumors and malignant and non-malignant hematology run across WHO Europe in the last 5 years. And we can see that only roughly 15% of trials in phase 2 use prompts, and only about 27% in phase 3 studies use prompts. And in those that use prompts, it was mainly generic instruments. So like the EQ5D, so not very sensitive to patient reality. It's more like, how do patients feel and function in general, but not really to understand, are the main impacts on quality of life coming from depression or from anxiety or from specific symptoms or from whatever. You can't tell that from generic prompts. You need to have specific prompts, and only 15% of the prompts we found were actually specific to the disease, and 46% were both generic and specific. So there's still a big gap. And now if we talk more about, are the pro data published? And that's really worrying. I mean, look at that. We have more than 5,000 clinical trials in these diseases. And you remember I presented that probably more than 50% of them use prompts, but only 2.75% of those trials have articles published that contains pros in their abstracts. So you can see there's a huge gap between trials that use prompts and the data getting into the public. So why bother? Why do we do all the efforts? Why do we ask patients to fill out all these questionnaires or do their e-pros if later on the data sits on hard disk and no clinician, no regulatory authority, no other researcher will actually see that? And then, of course, for us as a patient community, we don't have these subscriptions. So only about 1/3 of publications that have pro in their abstracts are actually open access. So there's a huge issue, I think, and room for improvement, and actually a way how we could work together, because in the end, that's a huge benefit for the research community and for the patient community to think about patient experience data. Remember the triangle, understanding patient preferences and looking at toxicity in a different, more consistent way, and thinking about quality of life and pros. Doing that in studies consistently will actually change a lot in terms of survivorship, and how we shape cancer research in the future. So as my final slide, all essential ingredients for impactful patient involvement in cancer research are there. We have a shared purpose. Everybody's talking about patient centricity today. We have a lot of collaborative spirit. Think about what I presented about all the EU projects with all the patient community input and so on. Everybody wants to work together. And I think there's been a huge attitude shift over the years. There's clear political institutional will. So a lot has changed in terms of openness to collaborate across stakeholders. Remember all the chart with all the bubbles. We have huge amounts of engagement frameworks and tools. So it's more a question of which tool do I pick instead of how do I do that. And there are robust measures for patient preferences, patient-reported outcomes, and toxicity. We just need to use them in the studies, and we need to report about the data. The good thing, I haven't presented about this today, there's a well-trained capacity in the patient organizations, in companies and institutions today, because there are trainings by EU Party, trainings by the Wiccan Academy, trainings by a lot of different institutions that actually train the patient academy, researchers and industry about effective patient engagement and all the tools that I have mentioned. With that, thank you so much. I'm very much looking for discussions in our panel. Thank you so much for your time.
Dr. Mutebi and Mr. Geisler, thank you for your stimulating presentations. I would now like to ask that our other panel members come on camera so we can begin our discussion. Welcome, everybody. since we just heard from Miriam and Jan, before we get into the question and answer portions of the discussions, I would like to take a few moments and let our three other panel members, Ms. Kristen Klein-Branch, Ms. Marta Montero, and Dr. Aparna Park, introduce themselves. So, Kristen, let's start with you. Would you please briefly introduce yourself and tell us in a few short sentences why it is that you find yourself on this panel discussing patient centricity in clinical trial design and development in the context of cancer research?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for including me on this panel. Really appreciate it. And my name is Kristen Klein-Branch. I am the Director of Early Patient Engagement and Professional Societies here at BeiGene. And I just want to disclose that everything I'm sharing today, any examples, opinions, are based on my own experiences, not necessarily that of BeiGene. And I find myself on this panel, I think, because I'm very passionate about bringing the patient voice into clinical development programs. I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for over 20 years, and really I've put the patient at the center of everything we do. And most recently, over the past decade or so, I've been working on bringing patients into the clinical trial, clinical development aspect of pharma, and making sure that we co-create, as Jan had said, really co-create these research initiatives to make sure that we're bringing innovation to patients that meet their needs, not just the clinical needs of the medical community. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for that. Marta, same question to you.
Hi, everyone. Hope you are so fine, and thank you so much for inviting me. Well, my name is Marta. I'm living in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. I'm a cancer patient. I have been in treatment for the last 2 years. I had a cervix cancer with a lot of metastases in lots of parts of my body. And well, I have been living with the cancer kindly and as really as I can. And I took part in 2020. I was part of research of breast cancer. It was in an institute in Argentina called CEMIC, and they, I have written, they investigated. I was recruited in 2020 for 5 years, and they were investigating. The name of the research is tomosynthesis mammographic imaging screening trial, and I was part of this for 5 years so successfully. And then the COVID appears, and I took part of a trial about a vegetal vaccine. It was a COVID vaccine. The sponsor was Medicago, and it's a laboratory from Canada. And they study 3 randomized observer blinded vaccine recombinant with COVID-like particles. They started this vaccine from a plant like tobacco, not tobacco for smoking, of course. And well, my daughter, she's 22 now, and I was part of this research, this trial. And well, at the end, I discovered I was vaccinated, not my daughter, but both of these were magnificent experiences. And well, it's not very easy in Argentina to get known about this kind of research. But if you are active and proactive to these researches and trials. It's easy to take part, and well, and for me, both of them are they were really good experiences.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for that. Aparna, can you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Truly a pleasure to be here. So I have a couple of different roles. I'm a GI oncologist at Mass General. I oversee our young onset colorectal cancer program and have really learned through that kind of program and taking care of the younger patients with GI cancers, how critical and distinct actually the young patient voice is as well. I also oversee our global cancer care program, and kind of much of what Miriam was talking about sort of deeply resonated. And I think the disproportionality of kind of research coming out of Africa, and particularly some parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, is something that think about a lot in that program. And then finally conduct a lot of therapeutic trials as well. And I'm constantly trying to understand better how we can engage the patient voice. I think really important for us as researchers and clinicians to, not only indirectly but directly understand the lived experiences of a patient with cancer, and kind of prioritize those most important symptoms and impacts from the patient perspective. So it's truly a pleasure to be here, and thanks again. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, everyone, for those introductions. Obviously, we have a very expert panel with a broad range of expertise. I'm really looking forward to a thought-provoking discussion on how patient voices can be effectively integrated into the clinical trial process. So I'm going to start our discussion with a two-part question to you, Miriam. In your presentation, you mentioned that the majority of clinical trials that have taken place in Africa are really focused on the infectious disease space. Are there ways that you can apply learning from those trials to help increase patient engagement in the oncology trials? And also, you mentioned that a fairly small percentage, I think it was 13 of the 54 African countries, were responsible for 90% of the research that goes on. How would you recommend expanding clinical trials across the continent while keeping the patient voice central to trial design and development?
Thanks, Matt. Tricky question, but I'll try to maybe have a few reflections. My immediate sense is that it really requires a multi-level sort of engagement. And kind of as we'd outlined, you do need almost the grassroots advocacy, where you are letting or engaging healthcare providers and communities in learning about signs and symptoms of disease, but then looking at the additional layer where we're saying, well, how do we build the research infrastructure, and how do we sort of start to inject, for want of a better word, the research bug? What we find is, especially in many of our training settings, whether it's, especially around healthcare, there isn't really an emphasis on research, and research is kind of something you do maybe in your residency as an afterthought, as a dissertation you need to produce, but then sort of really building the base for all research. And that involves looking at basic questions. You might not necessarily get to clinical trials out of the gate, but if we're able to just build the mindset and framework where we're actually answering common questions around what's happening to our patients, what are the concerns, and using that as a stepwise base on which to focus clinical trials. Of course, the additional layer is from the advocacy, high-level advocacy, where we do know that research is unfortunately still underfunded. And I think in 2012 we had the African Union sort of make a pledge about where they would, devote at least 1% of the GDP of the country's GDP to research and development. That really hasn't sort of translated into actual practice. But then looking at how do we then engage with continental bodies like for instance, one of the issues we'd raised was around access. So how do the African Union has developed the African Medical Agency that's trying to look at how do we increase in-country, on-continent production of some of these medications, just to reduce the costs, and how do we have this transparency around pool sharing, price sharing, and actually leveraging our negotiation capacity to drop the cost of drugs. And so that is at least one layer of the argument. But then also looking at then how do we combine the access to clinical services with the community education and awareness, and with the healthcare workers and clinicians actually having the research genes switched on, such that research is actually part of your day-to-day practice. It should be. I mean, we do this all the time. We look at our outcomes and try and have a systematic way of doing this. But how do we streamline that? How do we mainstream that such that it's actually regular audits and building on research is part of the data is really where we're looking at. But then in response to your second comment around, second question around how do we leverage off existing frameworks? I think, again, it's a historical background, just because for the longest time, there's been quite a number of infectious diseases, malaria, TB, HIV have been really the major priority diseases in the region. But then we've seen that we've gotten a handle in terms of the management of that, such that we're now seeing more deaths from cancers than HIV, TB, and malaria combined, meaning that, there is an opportunity to think about what are they doing right. And part of the things that we've discovered is not trying to reinvent the wheel. It's really around what Jan was saying around collaboration and stakeholder engagement. How do we get these existing teams that have been doing clinical trials and shifting them just a little notch higher into oncology clinical trials, keeping in mind that the same processes are still germane across the board. How do we get, lessons on, patient engagement? There have been brilliant examples around leveraging technology, using mobile phones are not just necessarily smartphones, even just a regular phone to send patient prompts to have them come into clinics are some of the examples that we could perhaps leverage around the existing frameworks. And then also looking at what they've been able to successfully do is really develop those consortium, whether in country, in region, that try to sort out some of the more fine aspects of time to activation for trials, and really having like pooled IRBs and those kind of granular levels, and educating teams is really some of the things that we can adopt as best practice to oncology. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Following up on what Miriam just said, Aparna, from your perspective as a physician, practicing in the young adult colon cancer space, how do you think we as a community can better engage patients at both ends of the age spectrum in clinical trials? And how have you dealt with that in your own practice?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest, challenges that we've seen with the younger patients particularly is the assumption that their needs are just comparable to the kind of average patient that's walking in the door. And I think even as you start to take care of them clinically, these are patients that fertility is often an issue. They're in the peak of their earning capacity, and young parenting with young children, peak of their careers. And there's so many other kind of variables that are going into even the clinical care. And I think all of these are a little bit taken not for granted by any means, but are not necessarily, considered as thoughtfully in clinical research as we need to consider these features. And I think part of it is just by starting to ask, right? I think, we have been starting to do just a needs assessment of the patients walking in our door that are younger, and kind of tell us where we are failing you, tell us where we can do better, tell us what's working well, tell us what's not. And that even act of asking, I think, is very empowering. And Jan, I mean, I certainly don't want to speak on the patient voice, but we find that just being able to allow patients to have a voice can open the door and for conversations, and then allow them to engage in meaningful research as well. I think the other thing that it seems simple, but it's something that I've learned over my last several years, not only the young program, but as I write grants and protocols, I love the idea of having like a patient on the IRB, right? Every grant that you're writing, every protocol you're writing, it's simple, but get a patient involved from even preconception to completion. And especially with the younger patients, I think trying to ensure that we have their voice and kind of not assuming that they are overwhelmed and don't want to engage, because they do want to engage. And so a little bit all over the place, but it's a unique patient population that I think is unfortunately not just in the US, but across the globe, a growing demographic. And I think we have to start to understand their needs a little bit better.
No, thank you for that. So, Jan, I will turn to you, and I want to come back to your presentation again, sort of a multi-part question. You mentioned that research looking at patient-reported outcome measures and the subsequent publication of those PROMs over the past 5 years. And in your presentation, you stated that something like only 140 trials out of over 5,000, have published with PROs in their abstracts. Do you have thoughts on why that might be the case, or what strategies researchers can employ to increase the number of articles that they publish with PROs in their abstracts? Obviously, to help engage or to get that information to the general population, and what lessons can other regions take from the European experience to help publish those PRO data?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I mean, there's probably two parts in the reasons why clinical patient-reported outcome data is actually not being published. And one is that it's not even collected in the studies, and the other one is if it's collected, it's not being published. And of course, this is a chain of events which leads to the percentage that we think, or we have observed in the studies that we run in Europe in the past 5 years. And I would say the first thing is that probably patient-reported outcomes are not seen as a priority, not seen as a priority when you design studies, and not seen as a priority when you actually publish this important data and you have about, I don't know, 5,000 words or 10,000 words for the publication. So you totally take care of the attention on clinical outcomes. And well, then there's this paragraph about the treatment was well tolerated and the quality of life of patients was good. This is what we then often see as a result of patients filling out 10 pages of quality of life questionnaires at each visit, which doesn't do, let's say, the effort justice. So I think it's a matter of priority, that clinical outcomes comes first and PRO is then the second paper that never comes. So what can we do about it? I mean, what I usually say is, if you want to move cats, you need to move the food. So how do you do that? On one hand, I think if you think about publishers and publications and peer reviewers, if they would actually put in their guidance more about if there's PRO data, you should also be publishing it. So it should be a part in your in your submission, in your manuscript, because that would largely influence the way it's being done. We see that in publicly funded projects in Germany. Once that patient engagement has been part of the calls, suddenly all the calls that apply for patient engagement actually have patient engagement in it in varying quality, but that's then up to the reviewers to actually say, well, can you elaborate on this a bit more? For industry studies, I think the FDA guidance on patient-reported outcomes in cancer clinical trials, a guidance for industry, which was published about 2 weeks ago, will make a big difference because it moves the food for industry. They've always been complaining there is no guidance on PRO. Now there it is. So I think the whole issue about PFDD and PD and now PRO guidance really helps to drive industry. And I feel in my work as a patient advocate, very often there's little knowledge about patient-reported outcomes in clinicians as well. So I think we need to do more training because very often we see that also outdated instruments are being used. Or you saw in my presentation the generic ones. So very often they don't know there's a really cool tool and there's really a let's say, sensitive measure of patient reality in a specific cancer. And probably Europe has been leading with ERTC in the quality of life work in developing the ERTC QC30 and all the disease-specific, cancer-specific modules as an add-on to them. But very often I think we need to actually make people more aware that these tools exist and that they really make sense. And they're not just these bothersome 12-page questionnaires that neither the clinician likes, nor the nurse, nor the patient, but they really generate important data. So the whole education piece about pros and prompts and instruments, as well as the kind of guidance in the both academic and industry setting, I think helps to probably drive adoption. And of course, the data that we've presented and we've collected is retrospective in the past 5 years. And we see that change now picking up slowly because the studies that have been completed, of course, were designed 6-7 years ago. Now the studies that are now designed are taking more respect and more care about patient-reported outcomes too. So I think I'm quite positive this will be changing.
That's a very good point, that as our practices change, it takes a while for those manuscripts and those data to ultimately get out into the public domain. So we should be starting to see that. Yeah, thank you for that. Kristen, I'd like to turn to you next. Could you please talk about ongoing efforts at Beijing and, to the extent that you can, other pharmaceutical and biotech organizations to include more patients throughout the life cycle of the clinical trial? And additionally, how does the involvement of patients help industry continue to innovate and advance the types of research and drug development that they're doing?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for the question. I think there has been a trend, and I think, Jan, some of your slides also showed the trend that there is a lot more emphasis on bringing patients in early and often into the development phase so that we're co-creating these innovative trials for patients. And I think we're learning there's so much we can learn from patients and to understand the different touch points in a patient's journey on when a clinical trial can become, number one, part of their potential treatment plan. And then to make sure that when we are asking, clinical trials are not easy. There's a lot that we're asking for patients, right? So let's make sure to make these trials accessible and make sure that we're asking the right questions that are going to make the data of the trial important to the patient. So we are seeing definitely a trend in the industry to bring patients on early and to co-create. We've seen it where there are patients on steering committees, where we start with patients very early on in the development process to understand the unmet needs of the patient so that we can add, it might not be a primary endpoint, we can add the exploratory endpoints to help answer those questions that the patients have. To Jan's point about PROs, making sure we have the right patient-reported outcomes and using the right tools early on in our studies to making sure, again, that the impact on the quality of life of the different therapies that we are investigating are being studied. Looking at even if just asking, here's the different quality of, here's the different PRs we're looking at and the different things we're measuring, asking patients, what are we missing here? What are the things that aren't being captured that are really important to you? Sometimes you hear from maybe the clinician side or the physician side that, maybe headache, for example, isn't the number one thing that a physician is thinking about, but to a patient that might be very debilitating and they want data on, is this going to, help with my quality of life and help with my headache? And when we really think about, we want to bring, particularly in the cancer space, right? We have so many patients waiting for the next innovative treatment that if we can bring patients along and help us co-create the study design, make sure they have input into the study design, into some of the operational aspects of the study to make the trials more accessible, easier to enroll, that actually have more cultural sensitivities to include everyone, we can potentially speed up the process of having new therapies approved. CTTI published some data in 2018 where they showed that actually engaging with the patients early, you could save on a phase 2 about 6 months to approval. You can get things to be approved 6 months sooner by including patients early. And in a phase 3, phase 2 was 9 months, phase 3 was 6 months. So think about that time. Every single minute counts when patients are waiting for these new therapies. If we can shorten the time to approval by enrolling these trials faster and by asking the right questions, this is something I think that would benefit everybody all around. So there is definitely, we are seeing the interest, as Jan had also mentioned, the interest of patients wanting to be part of this process and industry wanting to partner with patients, and then also the regulatory agencies understanding how important patient insights are into our drug development programs to help move innovation forward.
Thank you. That's very insightful. Yeah, the length of time that you can save by engaging patients very early in the process, that is a huge benefit to everybody, you know, in being able to bring these novel therapeutics forward. So, Marta, if we come to you, so as a person who's has a lived experience with cancer, can you please describe your experience about education with cancer trials and your engagement in those cancer trials in Argentina, and based on that education and the experience that you've had with your cancer trials, can you give physicians and the research community and the pharmaceutical and biotech industries, what kind of advice could you give to those different groups on how to include the patient voice in those trial designs and implementation?
Okay, I'm not an expert and I don't have any kind of figures like you. I am not the typical cancer patient because I believe I will survive. I will take part of any kind of research, trial, investigation, and doctors said that I have 1 or 1.5 year surviving, but I will survive. I will take part of I really appreciate you invite me to this kind of discussion. Argentina is a very poor country. People mostly don't have access to all the information. Perhaps I can, but I am also really involved in this kind of treatments and new things, and I absolutely agree with Christine that every minute it's not perhaps I will die the same, but it's with another kind of sensation that it's not a crime you committed. It's only I got healthy. People in Argentina try not to speak about cancer. They you know that I am doing some kind of treatment, but please don't tell anybody. I don't want people know. And I believe that all of these that don't help to these people, unhealthy people, take part in the very poor and few trials. It's not, of course, I live in Buenos Aires. It's the capital of the country, and I live in a suburb with a easily access to medical treatments, and well, people, for example, who lives in another parts of the country are really spending so worse. Like all of you have explained, I am speaking about this, and there are provinces in my country without water. So what we can expect that this person be proactive about his illness if they don't have the basic things like water or the access to I don't say a big hospital, but the access to a doctor. And I consider that people, there are a lot of myths. Why doctors don't cure cancer? They are in it's a business, and well, now I know it's not like this. But all of these beliefs that people have don't really help to people get involved in trials, in research. But people they say, for example, like me, I have a cervix cancer, and the only thing people do is watching a video in YouTube. And with this information, they take decisions about their health. My humble advice, because I am only a patient fighting against this cancer, it's that perhaps publicity would help. And well, people like me, I am absolutely willing to work with whatsoever which can save my life. And if I am not going to save my life, if in the middle I can help somebody, for me it's a 10 too.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think your perspective, you're saying you're humble, right? But I mean, you play a very important role. I think that's what all of us on this call are saying, that you, the patients, need to express what the important parts of your treatment and how what is important to you as part of your treatment. And I think being able to get that information out there is exactly what we're talking about here today. So thank you for that.
Only one only one more thing that I believe that Jan was really right, that sometimes I don't say always like me, but sometimes help the patient, really help a proactive listening, or listening body symptoms. For example, in my own experience, I told that I have symptoms that I of course I am not acknowledged about this, but I feel myself unhealthy. And 3 years later, I got my first biopsy. So sometimes we the patients know when, not in all the cases, mostly, I knew that something was wrong, and I look for a lot of places and doctors, and it was hard to listen to me that I believe I am. Of course, I didn't know it was cancer and the kind of cancer I got, but listening. I know it's hard, and you've got a lot of patients, and patients say things like, if you mix curcuma and lemon, you are going to. I know this, but sometimes in some cases we know that something is wrong.
No, exactly. So we actually have a question from an audience member that sort of gets to this question. So, and I'll open it up. Maybe Jan, how can the global research community, or Miriam, the global research community, better support and advocate for inclusiveness in research? Right? Jan, I'll give that to you.
Sorry, who's first?
Jan, go ahead if you want to.
Okay. No, I mean, of course, the whole issue of diversity, equity, inclusion is extremely important. And I think recently there has been more attention, probably also driven by, let's say, requirements or guidance from the regulatory side. And I think the whole issue of diversity, equity, inclusion needs to be more respected and more looked at trial design stages. So we've recently engaged in a lot of different factors there, because there's so many different influential factors: social gradients of health, adverse healthcare experiences, access barriers, heterogeneity in treatment effect, and so on. And I mean, from a European perspective, there is also a lot of let's say, issue about migrant communities, which is probably a very European thing, where people move around. They live in a country of a healthcare system they don't understand, of a language they don't speak. And at the same time, of course, to have a more diverse population in these countries where trials are actually happening, we need to think about how do we explain and how do we build trust in those communities, that they feel like trials and research are for them. So I think there's a lot we can do, and there's, again, it's a collaborative topic between the clinicians and the patient community to think about how do we reach out, what are the barriers for research access and research participation, and how do we reach out to communities we usually don't reach out at the top cancer centers and in the metropolitan areas where the trials are often being run. I think in the patient community, we're looking a lot at that topic at the moment.
Miriam, there's actually a sort of related, question that, as current president of the African Organization for Research and Training in Cancer, or AORTIC, are there initiatives related to patient-centered clinical trial access for Africa that you hope to achieve under your presidency and as part of the broader aortic goals?
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, for sure. I think one of the things that has been highlighted really by both Jan and Marta is the need for collaboration and looking at how do we as a global oncology community sort of get people moving in the right direction. I think if we're looking at, the burden in Africa, where we're saying we have about 17% of the world's population and roughly a quarter of the disease burden, with only 3% of clinical trials happening in the setting, whether it's infectious diseases or no, it's then how do we as a global community sort of advocate for this? And I think the first step is really around having people who are actually running clinical trials in other settings, whether it's in high-income settings, saying, there is a need for diversity, and how do we, even as we run these trials, have opportunities to look at these in different settings. I think that's the first. And then looking at how do we then, again, we also say charity begins at home. So how do we in-house sort of set up, even with, people pushing from HICs, how do we develop a receptive framework, so to speak, that would allow and facilitate clinical trials? And part of this is really looking around what I'd mentioned around the clinical trials consortium that is really looking at mapping who's running clinical trials, how are they running them, who's sort of waiting, in the sidelines wanting to elevate to the next level, and how do we help to support those? And part of the things that we're trying to look at broader over the next couple of years is, I think clinical trial training has been pretty reliant on the PI. And, once you have, the PI trained, you say, yes, we've done X amount of training for clinical trials, but then sort of realizing we're setting them up to fail, because as soon as they get back to their institution and they're saying clinical trials and they're like, what, look at the caseload, that kind of thing. So it's really around, and the direction we're looking at in aortic is looking at team training. And so beyond the PIs, looking at the critical parts of the teams, whether it's the oncology nurses, whether it's the pharmacists, whether it's the community healthcare workers, which kind of drills down to Marta's point around awareness in the community, because you can have all this lovely framework sitting there, but if you're not getting patients in, and if they think that, their cancer is caused by, somebody who's, had a grudge with them, or is contagious, or there's still a lot of stigma, then they're not going to rock up. So what we're trying to do from a community and grassroots level is, one, we're actually running trainings in collaboration with stakeholders, where we are looking at our priority cancers, which in Africa is basically breast, prostate, cervical, colorectal, liver, and esophageal, along with hematological malignancies, and of course childhood cancers. But looking at how do we train the workforce, one, to engage with communities, two, increase the knowledge in the workforce around the common signs and symptoms, so that they can actually pick up these patients, strengthen our referral pathways, and educate primary healthcare providers on what the referral pathways are in their own ecosystem, so they know how to send patients upstream. But then also getting opportunities for them to increase awareness, but also strengthen the research advocacy component, where we're saying, even as you get people in, how do you reduce stigma? Or you can have people sitting on an IRB, which we're saying is a gold standard. We want people to sit on IRBs. We want them to contribute actively. But what we realized is that there is a power differential, right? If I'm getting, a patient of the clinic and telling them, come and sit on an IRB, they're not going to say anything. They're just intimidated. We're like, they're all these doctors, they probably know best. So it's, how do we strengthen the patient voice, and how do we give them the tools to ask the right questions? And so that's part of the research advocacy training that we're trying to do, where we're getting CSOs, cancer survivors, cancer advocates to really start to ask, what are the questions that make sense to us? Does this make sense? Even if it, how is this going to benefit my community? What is the sort of longevity or long-term plan for some of these studies that we're trying to do? I mean, somebody did a recent analysis of just drug-related clinical trials globally, and try to look at how many communities and LMICs actually had access to the drug post-trial, and this was a dismal less than 7%. So how do you then start to get empower our advocates to ask the right questions, and really give them the tools to really think through things like pushing for pragmatic trials, as Jan was saying, does this work in the real world? Does it make sense? Rather than perhaps pushing trials that may not necessarily reflect the priorities and needs on the ground. So those are just some of the strategies that we're doing from both the clinician and grassroots level. But of course, the higher level advocacy is really around pushing our collaborators, whether it's through the CDC or WHO, to start to hold our governments more accountable in terms of providing and increasing funding for healthcare and research. Thanks.
Thank you. Aparna, you have something you would like to add?
No, I mean, hard to follow those comments.
Yeah.
But I think one thing that I think it's important just for us to talk about a little bit is kind of the language of oncology. I think there's been a lot of shift over the last few years into how we are inherently, but maybe implicitly and not with malintent, using a lot of loaded terms that appear to put blame on patients. I think we say the patient failed treatment, right? The patient screen failed a trial. The patient didn't fail the screen, like we failed them by having these, tremendous eligibility criteria, or having, impracticalities with trial enrollment that make it challenging for a patient to get on. And so I think these habits feel ingrained, but I think there's opportunities for us to change. It may take a generation. I think a lot of this kind of short language that we use was not, again, meant to be with malintent, but I think we have to be much more cognizant of the language we're using and kind of teach the next generation of trainees to be thoughtful around words and, teaching that words matter. In the US, there's now open access to medical records, right? So patients can see the notes immediately post signing that the providers are written. And in my own practice as well, that has really taught me around how to be very thoughtful of what I'm writing, because their patients are reading this. And I think teaching each other and helping each other learn together without being but without putting people down, but helping encourage the community to be more thoughtful around language and word choice, I think is also important.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I have a couple of questions for as we start getting towards the end of our discussion, the questions that I want to open up to everyone on the panel. The first of those is that, in the United States, there are significant barriers for specific populations to access and engage in clinical trials that can lead to significant treatment disparities in terms of race, age, geographic locations. So are there similar clinical trial access disparities more globally? And what are your thoughts on how to address those? And I know we've sort of touched on those, throughout this presentation, but if there are additional thoughts that any of the panelists may have, I think the audience would surely value them. So maybe we'll start, Marta, with you, if you have thoughts on the disparities.
Well, again, I'm not an expert here. I only speak about my own experience. I consider that education, it's well, and of course, like Irma was saying, the way the way that doctors speak to patients, young patients, over more, and for example, I have all the duties I have with my illness, plus a lot of things with my social security. It's another work I have now, because every treatment I had to do needs an authorization or something like this. And well, I consider a privileged person in my country because I have all of this. It's near for my house. It's so accessible for me. And most of the country, Argentina is, I hope we will improve, but healthy. It's doctors are really badly paid, and all of this, it's an environment that perhaps don't help the cancer itself, the patient itself, the amount of time each doctor needs for a patient. In my case, I have a very rare type of cancer, so violent. I do metastasis every day. So doctors are really interested in me, and they practice with me, and I'm so grateful, of course. But it's not the media. So they are really interested in knowing, perhaps my own cancer might help other treatments in the future. I beg you discover something soon. But
Thank you.
I consider that it's a lot of things that all together they are a lot for a cancer patient. I don't know why, but I feel happy and absolutely consider me for anything which appears, but I know I am really conscious that it's not the most of the population
Right.
with cancer in Argentina like this.
Right. Kristen, maybe I'll ask you the same question, just from your perspective. Are there ways that we can address those disparities?
And you did say Kristen, right? I couldn't.
Yes, I did. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
perfect. So, there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done in this area. I think everybody on this call and listening to this call knows we need to do work here. And it is global. I can tell you, even in my position as a global position, I hear it from all over the world, the different disparities. And access and availability of clinical trials, how clinical trials are talked about or not talked about. There's a lot of different aspects to this. And, the patient organizations I'm noticing are doing a lot more work in this area. They're really focusing on, and they have entire programs where they're focusing on educating their patient community on clinical trials, on the importance of clinical trials, how to talk about clinical trials, how to find clinical trials, how to read ct.gov, how to bring it up to their physician, how to proactively talk about it. And then they're having those patients that are trained in this go out and speak to other patients and go out into the communities and go to where patients are, whether that be at community events, church events, where people are, get boots on the ground where people are, to really increase this dialogue that we have in clinical trials. And I think it's really important, again, for sponsors and industry to think about what are some of the barriers to clinical trials. I know a partner you had mentioned earlier about the younger population, they have families, they're in their career. How do we support that? How do we, as sponsors, is there a way that we can help support, childcare? Or there's a lot of people at this who are taking care of their children and their parents, right? So how do we support this to financially help them have the time to go to their clinical trial appointments? Can we do some more telehealth? Can we bring some more of this into the community? One of the things that I'm really a proponent of is, think about travel services, particularly patients who have, who live in far away from academic medical centers where a lot of the trials are, right? They're newly diagnosed with something. They're struggling to meet their basic needs. Now they have the trauma of a diagnosis. We're talking to them about a clinical trial and then say, okay, we'll reimburse you for your travel, but make the travel arrangements on your own, pay for it ahead of time. And sometimes some of these trials, you have to go stay, near the center for 90 days. So you've got to go find a hotel, put a credit card down that you may or might not have or have enough money on it, and prepay all of this to be reimbursed, 12 weeks later, potentially, where this is money. You have to decide, do I put food on the table for my family, or do I pay for this travel? Where if we as sponsors can work with some of the organizations that have these wraparound travel services, where the service can potentially book the travel for the patient, can pay for the hotel, can pay for the flights, to try and at least ease that burden. I also know for some patients, it's not possible to travel. They're immunocompromised. The less, there's so many different things I think that we need to look into to really help make these trials more accessible, but at the same time, making sure our trials do take care of the patient and put patient safety first, right? So there's so many things to think about. And this is constantly what I'm thinking about as we start to get patients involved in the trial. And we have patients, I think the important thing is to have patients look at your study designs, have patients look at the different schedule of assessments, and have them let us know what are the barriers and do you have any solutions so that we can help make this trial easier and more, I hate to use the word attractive, but something that is meeting your needs that would, want you to be a part of.
Thank you. And actually, Kristen, something that you mentioned about essentially educating patients on how to then go out into the community and do that sort of stuff. We have a question from the audience that, Jan, I'm going to address to you that sort of gets to that education part of it. And, they're asking, how as advocates can we encourage the use and inclusion of PROS? So how do we educate patients and other advocates to be able to encourage those uses of important PROS?
Well, I think there's been tremendous efforts over here in Europe to actually train the patient community through various efforts. We have the European Patients Academy, which is a training institution, a nonprofit that actually trains patient advocates about patient involvement in medicines R&D and the fundamentals of research. So I think this has been a game changer over here to actually empower the patient community in all different kinds of indication areas to understand research, understand how clinical trials work, to understand what the schedule of events has of an impact into patients' lives when they join clinical studies and need to deal with it every day when they go to the clinical centers, and all these different things. And I think EUPADI has moved a lot on that, just because the patient community as such got more empowered in talking about research. And of course, this trickles down, and Kristen was actually addressing that. The patient community are the ones usually, or the patient organizations are the ones reaching out to the patient community, telling about research, telling about, let's say, trying to take the myths out of research, trying to explain the safeguards that are in place to run research, and also the role of ethics committees and whatever. So the patient community is putting this into lay terms. If you take, for example, my leukemia organization, because I'm a CML patient myself, I mean, we've ran a registry of clinical trials for about 20 years now, and I know they're public registries from the EMA and so on. But what we needed are these 3 pages which explain the basics of what's the trial for, what is the inclusion criteria, at which trial sites is this being run, which are the investigators that I need to contact if I want to participate in a clinical study. But of course, we only do this in CML, while others do it in breast cancer or another rare cancer. So I think the patient community has an extremely important part. And that's probably something we always need to think of. Their different patient organizations. There are some which are excellent on the national, local level. They know how healthcare is being delivered. They know the centers, they know the investigators, they know where to reach out to diverse populations and so on. And they have a different scope than the more global patient organizations, which are specialists in research. So we know all the data. We work with all the KOLs. We go to the clinical conferences like ASH and ASCO and ESMO and whatever. So we hear science and we try to translate it into lay terms. And both work together because usually the national members are the members of the umbrella organizations. And that's why I can just call on a partnership strategy with the patient community. When you want to make sure that PRO end up in trials, the trials are designed in a way that they capture the right things and focus on the right endpoints. And then when the trials are run, or when the trials are being planned for different countries or settings, then the national patient organizations can help to plan, to implement, to communicate about it, to disseminate results, that patients are going with these kind of results to their doctor and say, I've heard there's this piece of research, is this relevant for me? I think that's the collaboration that we need. And I think we've come a long way over the last couple of years to get that connection between industry, academic research, patient organizations on the global national level connected.
Thank you. So I know I had started this last section saying that I wanted to open a question up to the other to all the panelists. So before I move on, Miriam or Aparna, is there anything that you would like to add to this discussion about, are there, access or clinical access disparities in Europe and globally before we move on?
Go ahead, Miriam. You go for it.
Sure. No, I was just going to say, I think COVID just, I think was the great democratize it because it just showed us that there were disparities irrespective of where you were and really the fragility of health systems. So I think even irrespective of where you are going to have disparities. They are vulnerable populations. I think part of the consideration in my mind, just listening to the excellent submissions from Kristen and Jan, is really around patient education and the support for the entire journey. I think one of the considerations that we particularly face, and this is again an inequities concern, is because we're getting people enrolling because that is the only way they can have access to some of these treatments. And so it's a bit of a difficult ethical dilemma because you get the treatment, you're on the clinical trial, or you don't get the treatment, and that is unacceptable. And so for me, it's thinking through how do we sort of strengthen the systems where you're not going on clinical trial because it's a necessity, but because, you're able to make an informed decision. I mean, you can sort of talk all the way home, but then we're looking at financial toxicity is real. And if I tell you, you have this opportunity where, the clinical trial is going to pay for your transport, it's going to pay for your treatment, you begin to see the problem. And so it's really looking at how do we then, on the one hand, yes, increase enrollment, but also try and ensure that, patients are still making informed decisions, but also pushing our policymakers to actually improve access to these key drugs and treatments if we are truly going to put patients, irrespective of where they are in the world, being able to make informed decisions, not just based on their pocket. That was just my one reflection regarding the whole thing. Thanks.
I think the other reflection, kind of Miriam just chatted around what, we saw COVID as a democratizer, but, we also saw with COVID a tremendous opportunity overnight in terms of the delivery of medical care, particularly clinical trials, like really, really thinking about what needed to happen. What were the visits? What were the time points? What were the labs? What were the assessments? In the US, the lifting of the kind of cross-border, cross-state practicing regulations that allowed us to see patients at their home, irrespective of state. And, unfortunately, we had this opportunity and it worked. And, we came back and fell into our normal ways of doing and being very quickly post-pandemic. And I think there was a tremendous opportunity that we rose to the challenge then. And I'd like to see us really go back, not to the pandemic, but at least go back to the ways we thought around, efficiency and what was absolutely needed. And, expanding care beyond, academic medical centers for trials, in a way that I think has really done a patient post-pandemic a disservice. So just a couple of thoughts there.
Thank you. So as we come to the end, ask each one of you in one sentence or less. Now, what is one concrete policy or practice recommendation that we need to continue to expand or to implement to continue to expand patient centricity in cancer research and clinical trial design? Kristen, I'll start with you.
I know this is often said, and I just don't think we can say it enough. Engage with patients early and often to really make sure we are co-creating development plans and therapies that meet the patient's needs.
Thank you. Jan.
Well, picking up on what Miriam said, I think you said strengthening the systems, and that's, I think, the most important bit that we need to do in collaboration. We need to work together, and I can just call on the patient communities probably the weakest point and the strongest point in that, because we have the national and international umbrella organizations and patient advocates, which can provide a very strong voice because it's our life. We have our skin in the game, so we can change the rules of the game sometimes. So that's why involving the patient community early when you design studies, but also involving the patient community systematically and structurally in trying to strengthen the system is probably the most important call, and the rest will follow.
Thank you. Marta, what do you see as an important
Well,
piece?
Again, I agree with all of them. If I have to say something, it's the engagement. I believe it's really important. In my country, in my conditions, I consider that more publicity. We have a few trials and research and investigation, but if we have few and people don't get access to know that this exists. For example, the breast research trial I took part. This was for any kind of women who was in between 30 and 50, and very few people, as I don't remember who said that, women to women or patient to patient, say, well, you can go to, or you can take part of this, go. I insisted, for example, some of my friends, and we are all women that we have information, we give information. So engagement and work together. If I at the minimum I can help, I am involved and
Thank you. Getting the word out.
I engaged
Yeah,
and get
Excellent.
involved with the travel. This is a travel. It's a work.
Right. Aparna.
I would say sort of a pragmatic trial designs with a focus on decentralization as my, I think, takeaway here.
Thank you. And Miriam.
I think excellent comments from the panel. I think one of the other reflections I would say is investment. Unless there is deliberate and intentional investment in health systems and in research, we are really not going to move the needle. We can, have all these wonderful collaborations and really amplify each other and leverage each other's strengths. But we really need to start holding our policymakers and whatever's really accountable in terms of really ponying up and investing in health and really framing the narrative. People look at it at expenditure, but really framing the narrative as why an investment in health and research is a win, and really using that common voice to push for that at all fronts, whether at the policy systems level or grassroots level. I think that would be my take home. Thanks.
Sure. So excellent. Thank you, everyone. So this concludes our panel discussion, and I just want to thank all of you for a very engaging discussion around the important role of including patients in clinical research and how we can continue to expand their voice in trial design on a global scale. So now I will turn this over to Matt Izzo, who is a specialist at NCCN's Global Policy and Strategic Alliances, for his closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Izzo. I'm a specialist within the Global Policy and Strategic Alliances, as Matt mentioned. I would like to thank Matt, our moderator, and our esteemed panelists and all of the attendees for joining us today for this very productive and insightful discussion. I'd also like to thank the following supporters. Without you all, these discussions would not be possible, and we are grateful for their continued support. This webinar, as well as past editions of the Global Policy Webinar Series, are recorded and will be posted on the Global Policy website, as you can see below. So this will be up very shortly. I also want to mention that next year's edition of the Global Policy Webinar Series will have the following topics: individual health and the cancer burden globally, as well as the impact of climate change on cancer care globally. So please be on the lookout for more information surrounding these webinars. And then finally, I want to extend an invitation to join our NCCN Global Academy virtually on November 12th. This is an interactive session that will have modules focused on adaptation and implementation of guidelines outside the US, as well as a session on HTA and value considerations. So please, you can go to nccn.org/Global Academy, and we hope you can join us. So I want to thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.